37 points. In the first quarter alone. By the time the buzzer sounded, the other bench wasn't making excuses, they were just shaking their heads. Because when Caitlin Clark gets hot, there is no answer. And tonight, we found out just how honest the other side is willing to be about that. Welcome back to the channel. Let's break down exactly what happened, and what the opposing coach and players actually admitted afterward. Let's start with what actually happened on the floor, because the numbers alone tell most of the story. Indiana came out of the gate and buried the opposing defense in the first quarter, with Caitlin Clark setting the tone early, hitting from deep, finding cutters, and completely dictating the pace of the game. Then Kelsey Mitchell caught fire right behind her. And once both of them are clicking in the same game, that's not a matchup problem anymore. That's a full-blown crisis for any defense in this league. The other team clawed back in the second and third quarters, cutting into the deficit and showing real fight. But Clark's explosive third-quarter stretch put the game right back out of reach, and the fourth quarter sealed it for good. Setting the scene. Who was on the floor? Before we get into the reactions, let's talk about who was actually dealing with this problem, because context matters here. This opponent came into the game already missing their all-star center, Damiris Dantas, which meant their front-court rotation was already stretched thin before Clark and Mitchell ever got going. When you lose a piece like that, the whole defensive scheme has to shift. More help required on drives, less rim protection on second and third efforts, and more pressure on the perimeter defenders to not get beat off the dribble in the first place. That's exactly the kind of situation a guard like Clark thrives in. She doesn't just need one crack in a defense, she needs a sliver of hesitation, and she'll find the open man or pull up from 30 feet before help ever arrives. Without their starting center patrolling the paint, this team was already playing from behind before the ball was even tipped. One of their players even acknowledged it post-game. The emphasis wasn't on any one player stepping up, it was on everybody collectively doing more with the pieces available. That's coach speak for, we knew this was going to be an uphill battle, and the box score backs that up. The numbers behind the blowout. Let's actually sit with that first quarter number for a second, because 37 points in a single quarter is not a normal basketball statistic. That's not a hot start. That's a full-blown defensive collapse, and it happened almost entirely because of one thing: transition offense. When a team like Indiana gets out in the open floor early, it doesn't matter how good your half-court defense is, you never get the chance to use it. Clark was picking apart gaps before the defense even had a chance to get set, either scoring herself or finding shooters spotting up before rotations could happen. And once Kelsey Mitchell started catching fire in rhythm right alongside her, hitting threes in that same first quarter, the game essentially became unplayable for the defense in real time. It's worth pointing out that this wasn't a case of the opposing team playing lazy or disengaged. If anything, everything we heard afterward suggests the opposite: a team that was trying hard and still getting run over. That's usually the scarier version of a blowout for opposing coaches around the league, because "we made mistakes" is fixable. "We did most things right and still lost by 30" is a much harder problem to solve. The opponents didn't dodge it. Here's what makes this post-game reaction stand out: nobody made excuses. Natasha Howard and Flau'jae Johnson, who drew the unenviable task of trying to slow Clark down, were completely upfront about it afterward. They admitted the first quarter put them in a hole they never fully climbed out of, and that Clark's third-quarter surge was the moment the game slipped away for good. That kind of honesty is rare after a blowout. A lot of players lean on officiating gripes or "we'll get him next time" cliches. This group didn't. They basically said, "She was better than us tonight, and there wasn't much we could do about it." What stood out even more was how they talked about the rebounding battle. There was real physicality on the boards, even with a short-handed frontcourt, and one of the bigger contributors actually downplayed her own numbers post-game, insisting the team still left extra possessions on the table by not fully dominating the glass. That's the kind of self-critical mentality that tends to define teams which bounce back quickly from ugly losses. Nobody was pointing fingers outward. The second quarter turnaround. Now, credit where it's due, this wasn't a complete no-show from the defense all night. The second quarter told a very different story than the first. Once the opponent managed to slow the pace down and force more possessions into the half-court, their defensive activity picked up noticeably. More deflections, more physical ball pressure, smarter emergency switches when a mismatch popped up. It wasn't perfect, and it clearly wasn't enough to erase the deficit, but it was a legitimate adjustment, proof that the game plan wasn't broken, it just hadn't been executed early enough. That's actually a pretty encouraging sign for a team dealing with a missing all-star and an opponent playing about as well as it's possible to play in a single quarter. Falling behind by that much in the first 12 minutes and still clawing your way back into a competitive game for a stretch says something about the roster's resilience, even if the final result didn't go their way. The coach's take. Head coach Sonia Raman broke it down even further in her post-game comments, and this is where it gets interesting from an XS&OS standpoint. She pointed to transition defense as the root of the problem, Clark and company getting out in the open floor early and often, which led to that brutal 37-point first quarter. Once her team tightened up in transition and slowed the game into more of a half-court battle in the second quarter, the defense actually started to look completely different. More ball pressure, more deflections, better rotations on switches. Her point was pretty clear. Against a team hitting shots like this, you're not going to shut them out completely. Elite scorers are going to score. The difference between a manageable deficit and a blowout comes down to cutting off the easy buckets, and in that first quarter, there weren't many of those being cut off at all. She was also asked directly about a handful of questionable officiating calls during the game, including one particularly borderline foul call that happened right in front of the bench. Her answer was measured. She acknowledged that officiating is an incredibly difficult job, that her staff communicated their concerns through the appropriate in-game channels, and that she wasn't interested in manufacturing a technical foul just to make a point. What she did emphasize was consistency, wanting the same standard applied on both ends of the floor, while also praising her team for not letting frustration with the officiating bleed into their focus for the rest of the game. That's a pretty mature response from a head coach after a blowout loss, and it's part of why this post-game session became more newsworthy than the box score alone would suggest. Instead of deflecting, everyone from the coach down to the players chose accountability over excuses. The respect after the final buzzer. Now here's the part one actually think deserves more attention than it's getting. After the game, Clark walked over to Flau'jae Johnson, told her to keep her head up, and gave her a hug. And that moment says a lot, because it stands in direct contrast to a narrative that's followed Clark around all season, the idea that certain players are out there specifically targeting her. Let's be honest about the physicality, though. Johnson was playing Clark tough all night, contesting every possession like her season depended on it. If officials had called every bit of that contact, she might not have made it to halftime without foul trouble. But there's a difference between playing physical, competitive basketball and making it personal. What we saw after the game, the competitiveness during play, the respect immediately after, is honestly what healthy rivalry is supposed to look like. The targeting Clark narrative. Let's address this directly, because it's been a storyline all season long, and this game is a pretty good case study for it. There's been an ongoing narrative in WNBA media circles that certain opposing players go out of their way to play unusually rough against Caitlin Clark, targeting her specifically rather than just playing tough, competitive defense. It's a narrative that's generated a lot of discourse, plenty of debate about whether the physicality directed at Clark is any different from what other high-usage stars deal with around the league, and no shortage of strong opinions on both sides. This particular game is actually a useful data point against the more extreme version of that narrative. Yes, Johnson was physical, genuinely physical, to the point where foul trouble was a real risk. But the post-game body language told a completely different story than targeting. Respect during the battle, warmth after the final horn. If there was real animosity there, that hug doesn't happen, and Clark doesn't go out of her way to check on an opponent who just spent 40 minutes trying to make her life difficult. That doesn't mean every incident all season fits the same pattern. Some genuinely have sparked legitimate officiating and player safety conversations league-wide. But it's worth separating this specific game from the broader season-long narrative, because lumping every physical possession into one storyline flattens a lot of nuance that games like this one actually provide. What this means for the standings. Zooming out from just this one night, a win like this matters beyond the highlight reel. Every possession in a game decided by this kind of margin adds up over the course of a season, not just in the win column, but in point differential, which can matter significantly when playoff seeding gets tight later in the year. For the team that got run out of the building in that first quarter, the takeaway isn't really about talent or effort. Everything from the post-game comments suggests both were there. It's about slow starts. A team missing a key rotation piece can't afford to spot elite opponents a 20-plus point head start before finding its footing. If the second quarter defensive identity, the ball pressure, the deflections, the discipline in the half court, had shown up from the opening tip instead of after already trailing by double digits, this game likely looks a lot different on the scoreboard, even against a team playing this well. That's the kind of correctable problem coaching staffs actually love to see after a lopsided loss, frustrating as it is in the moment. It's not a talent gap. It's a start-of-game execution issue, and those tend to get fixed with reps and film study far more reliably than a genuine talent or scheme mismatch does. The Mitchell factor. We haven't spent quite enough time on Kelsey Mitchell's role in all of this, and she deserves it, because a night like this doesn't happen without her. When Clark is drawing the extra attention, the trapped pick-and-rolls, the face-guarding, the help defenders cheating off shooters just to slow her down, that's exactly when a secondary scorer catching fire becomes so dangerous. Mitchell hitting shots from deep in that same explosive first quarter meant the defense genuinely had no good answer. Load up on Clark, and Mitchell burns you from the perimeter. Extend out to Mitchell, and Clark gets a driving lane. That's the defensive nightmare scenario coaches talk about, and tonight it was on full display. This is really the story of Indiana's ceiling all season. When both of these guards are locked in on the same night, defenses simply run out of answers, regardless of scheme or personnel. Tonight was about as clean an example of that as you're going to see. Why this matters? This performance isn't just a highlight reel moment. It's a reminder of exactly how dangerous this Indiana team becomes the second Clark and Mitchell are both rolling in the same game. Defenses can game plan for one of them. Stopping both, on the same night, in rhythm, that's a different problem entirely, and tonight's opponents said as much themselves. It also reinforces something worth watching going forward. Teams that can limit transition opportunities early are giving themselves the best shot at staying competitive. The ones that can't are going to keep getting run out of the gym in first quarters like this one. And for the opposing coaching staff, tonight's film is actually going to be useful. The fix isn't a mystery. It's just a matter of applying that second quarter identity from the very first possession next time these two teams meet. So that's the full breakdown, a dominant start, an honest post-game reaction from everyone involved, a real in-game adjustment that came a quarter too late, and a genuinely classy moment after the final buzzer that got buried under all the numbers. Let me know in the comments. Was this the best quarter Clark's had all season, or have you seen better? And do you think the targeting narrative holds up after a night like this, or does it need more nuance? Like the video, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next one.